The morning of September 1st, 1939, dawned over Poland with an eerie sense of calm, a fragile quiet that would soon be shattered forever. Across the countryside, farmers tended to their fields and children played along dusty roads, unaware that history was about to pivot in a way that would change the world. Precisely 4:40. The silence was broken as German forces crossed the Polish border, initiating a conflict that would spiral into the global catastrophe we now know as World War II. This was not a simple invasion. It was the opening move of a calculated, revolutionary military strategy, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Blitzkrieg was unlike anything Europe had seen since the trenches of the First World War. Instead of slow, drawn-out battles marked by months of stalemate, the German army relied on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force to crush opposition before it could mount an effective defense. Tanks thundered across open fields, aircraft rained down from above, and infantry followed swiftly, securing territory and cutting off Polish communications. The goal was simple yet ruthless: end resistance quickly and decisively, preventing the prolonged suffering and attrition that had defined the last World War. But the story of September 1st is more than just tanks and planes. It is a story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Families awoke to the distant roar of engines and the unsettling thrum of approaching aircraft. Cities and towns braced for impact. As the threat of destruction was no longer theoretical, it had arrived at their doorstep. Krakow, Warsaw, and countless smaller towns would soon be engulfed in chaos. Yet the courage and resilience of civilians and soldiers alike would leave a lasting imprint on history. While the world would later recognize the strategic genius and terrifying efficiency of Blitzkrieg, it is crucial to remember the human cost that accompanied it. Lives were disrupted, homes destroyed, and communities forever changed in mere days. The invasion of Poland was not just the start of a military campaign. It was the ignition of a series of events that would draw nations from 3 continents into a war unlike any before. As we explore these pivotal moments, we will witness how the decisions of generals and leaders reverberated through towns and villages, impacting lives in ways both immediate and enduring. From the front lines of armored divisions to the frightened streets of Warsaw, the unfolding drama of September 1939 set the stage for a conflict that demanded courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice on a global scale. If you want to understand the origins of World War II and see history unfold in vivid detail, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Every week, we dive into the events that shaped our world, bringing stories of bravery, strategy, and human resilience straight to you. Join us as we journey back to that fateful day in Poland and uncover the forces that propelled the world into war. The story of Blitzkrieg and the people affected is a tale you want to miss. As dawn broke over the Polish countryside on that fateful day, the calm was deceptive, masking the storm that was about to sweep through the nation with unprecedented force. The German army had meticulously prepared for an operation that would redefine warfare, a method of attack that moved beyond the slow, attritional battles of the past and embraced speed, precision, and relentless momentum. This was Blitzkrieg, the so-called lightning war, a strategy designed not merely to engage the enemy but to shatter their capacity to respond, to strike at the nerves of a nation with surgical efficiency. Unlike the static trench lines of the First World War, where soldiers had endured years of mud, blood, and stalemate, Blitzkrieg relied on mobility, coordination, and the seamless integration of multiple arms of the military. Tanks and mechanized infantry would surge across open fields, supported by the deafening roar of Stuka dive bombers that tore through the sky, while radio operators relayed orders in real time, allowing units to adapt instantly to the shifting realities on the ground. The genius of this approach lay in its rhythm and psychology, in the way it sought to overwhelm the enemy before they could consolidate their defenses. The first waves of German panzers struck with terrifying precision, bypassing fortified positions where possible and striking at weak points to cut off communication lines, supply routes, and any chance of organized resistance. The intent was never simply to occupy territory. It was to create disarray within the enemy's command, leaving soldiers uncertain of where their next orders would come from, leaving civilians paralyzed by the speed of the assault, and forcing decision-makers into a reactionary mode, constantly scrambling to plug gaps in a front that seemed to move faster than they could comprehend. Across rivers, forests, and small towns, the advancing units carved corridors of control that allowed subsequent forces to follow through with minimal delay, turning what might have been a drawn-out campaign into a devastatingly swift conquest. Yet the reality on the ground was as human as it was strategic. For the soldiers on the Polish side, the initial onslaught must have felt almost surreal. One moment, the horizon was clear, dotted only with farmhouses and church spires, and the next, the ground trembled under the weight of armored vehicles, while the whine of aircraft overhead brought the unmistakable sense of imminent destruction. Communication lines, both literal and figurative, crumbled. Telephones went dead. Runners struggled to deliver messages through the chaos, and commanders found themselves increasingly isolated, making decisions in the dark as entire regiments were cut off or forced into hasty retreats. Each decision carried the weight of life and death, with units often left to face mechanized columns alone, their courage tested against an enemy whose strategy depended as much on shock and surprise as on brute force. The civilian experience mirrored this disorientation. Villages along the route of the invasion were suddenly transformed into zones of fear and uncertainty. Families fled along roads choked with refugees, trying to avoid both the advancing army and the chaos erupting behind them as local garrisons fell. Messages spread like wildfire. Towns had been captured, bridges destroyed, supply depots overrun, and resistance crumbling. In Krakow, the city's streets that had once been alive with daily commerce and social bustle became avenues of hurried evacuations and frantic attempts to safeguard what little possessions could be carried. Children clutched the hands of their parents, their innocence ripped away in a matter of hours, while the elderly moved as best they could, leaning on the hope that the storm would pass. The effectiveness of Blitzkrieg was not only a testament to the tools of modern warfare, but also to the doctrine that orchestrated their use. Commanders were trained to exploit every opening, to recognize opportunities in enemy mistakes, and to maintain an unbroken momentum that allowed successive waves of troops to continue the advance with little hesitation. Mobility was the lifeblood of the operation. Tanks needed fuel and repair, radios needed power, and soldiers needed coordination, all of which required careful planning and logistics behind the scenes. Yet, when executed correctly, these elements converged to produce a war machine that seemed almost unstoppable. The Polish forces, brave and determined, found themselves responding to a conflict unlike any they had prepared for, where the enemy's very speed and adaptability were their deadliest weapons. As the days unfolded, the corridors of advance widened, cities began to fall, and the strategic objectives of Blitzkrieg were realized with alarming efficiency. Each captured town or disrupted communication line did more than shift territory. It altered the psychological landscape, eroding confidence and instilling a sense of inevitability. The methodical precision with which the German army executed its plan was as much about breaking spirit as breaking forces, and by the end of that first week, the consequences were clear. Poland, though fiercely resisting in pockets, was already reeling under the impact of a strategy designed to render conventional defenses almost meaningless. The brilliance and brutality of Blitzkrieg lay not in the destruction alone, but in its orchestration of chaos as a weapon. It was a war of movement, of timing, and of exploiting every fissure in an opponent's defenses before they could solidify. As the armored columns pushed forward and air support struck with precision, the outcome was determined not only by firepower but by the ability to sustain momentum, to anticipate enemy reactions, and to strike decisively where hesitation could be fatal. This lightning war would soon become the model for Germany's early campaigns across Europe, demonstrating both the terrifying efficiency of modern mechanized warfare and the immense human cost that accompanied such speed. Even amid the devastation, one could see glimpses of human resilience. Soldiers improvising under fire, civilians helping neighbors escape, and commanders adapting plans in real time to protect lives while trying to slow the inexorable advance. It was a world in which the machinery of war collided with the fragility of human existence, leaving an indelible mark on history. September 1939 was no longer simply the beginning of a campaign, it was the opening chapter of a global conflict that would reshape nations, societies, and the very understanding of warfare itself. As the thunder of Blitzkrieg rolled across the Polish countryside, the reverberations were felt far beyond the borders of a single nation, touching capitals and parliaments across Europe, and even reaching the distant dominions of the British Empire. The invasion of Poland was not merely a local catastrophe. It was a spark that ignited a chain reaction among nations bound by treaties, alliances, and a shared sense of obligation, transforming a regional conflict into a global crisis almost overnight. In London, the atmosphere was tense and heavy with anticipation as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain convened the War Cabinet, the room thick with anxiety and the weight of historic responsibility. Papers rustled, voices murmured, and maps were spread across tables as officials attempted to grasp the scale of what had been unleashed, while Chamberlain had spent years pursuing a policy of appeasement, hoping that concessions to Adolf Hitler might preserve peace. The sight of German tanks crossing into Poland rendered such hopes untenable, forcing Britain to confront a stark and inescapable reality. War was now unavoidable. Across the English Channel in Paris, the French government was similarly galvanized. The memories of the Great War were still fresh, etched into the collective consciousness of a nation that had endured unimaginable suffering. And yet the leaders recognized that inaction was not an option. Troops were mobilized along the eastern borders, defensive positions were reinforced, and plans that had long been theoretical were suddenly thrust into action. The French and British governments were acutely aware that failing to respond would not only betray Poland but also embolden Hitler, potentially compromising the security of all Europe. Within days, formal declarations of war were issued, Britain at 11 of the clock on September 3rd, France following almost immediately, and soon after, nations from across the globe, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa joined in solidarity, their responses shaped by imperial ties, international obligations, and a recognition that Hitler's aggression threatened the stability of the world order itself. For the people of these nations, the news was both shocking and galvanizing. Streets and town squares filled with crowds listening intently to radio broadcasts, faces pale yet determined, as families grasped the gravity of what had begun. Children clutched their parents' hands while men and women prepared to leave for training. Enlistment offices swarmed with volunteers motivated by patriotism, fear, and a sense of duty that transcended personal safety. In Sydney and Wellington, young recruits boarded ships to join the fight in Europe, leaving behind familiar landscapes and loved ones, propelled by the understanding that the conflict, though distant, demanded their presence and their courage. In Cape, the realization that South Africa would be drawn into the European theatre stirred debates in homes and parliament alike, as citizens grappled with the implications of joining a war that was no longer confined to the continent they knew. The rapid expansion of the conflict underscored a new and chilling reality. Modern warfare had reached a level of interconnectivity and consequence that could no longer be contained. Strategic decisions made in Berlin resonated in distant cities, while the actions of armies and governments could no longer be viewed in isolation. Poland, initially the stage for a local confrontation, had become the flashpoint for a world in turmoil, illustrating the delicate web of alliances and treaties that bound nations together in a precarious balance. Diplomats scrambled to adjust, military planners recalculated campaigns with extraordinary speed, and civilians faced the dawning awareness that the war they had long feared was now unavoidable, and that its reach would touch every corner of the globe. In the midst of this unfolding drama, leaders like Winston Churchill, newly appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty, began to articulate a vision of the stakes involved. Unlike Chamberlain's cautious diplomacy, Churchill's perspective emphasized the existential nature of the struggle ahead. The war was not simply about territory or treaties, but about the preservation of fundamental freedoms, the survival of nations, and the defense of those who could not defend themselves. His speeches, later remembered for their eloquence and clarity, captured the tension and urgency of the moment, conveying to both Parliament and the public that decisive action was necessary, and that delay would be catastrophic. While the declarations of war formalized the global conflict, the reality on the ground in Poland remained grim. German forces continued their rapid advance, capturing towns, disrupting communications, and isolating pockets of resistance, while the Allies began coordinating support, mobilizing troops, and preparing to intervene. The speed at which the conflict escalated, from a border skirmish to a multi-continent war, highlighted the vulnerabilities and interconnectedness of the modern world. It revealed how quickly a local act of aggression could set off a cascade of responses, binding nations into a conflict far larger than anyone had anticipated. Even as governments acted, ordinary people bore the emotional weight of these monumental events. Families wrote letters to loved ones, cities held silent vigils, and the press carried headlines that spoke simultaneously of courage and catastrophe. Across oceans and continents, the human dimension of war began to unfold in parallel with the military maneuvers. Fears of separation, the anxiety of impending battles, and the uncertainty of survival became the shared experience of millions. This was the birth of a truly global war, not merely in its geographic scope, but in its capacity to touch every life, to influence every society, and to demand sacrifices that transcended borders and oceans. By mid-September, it was unmistakable that the invasion of Poland had irrevocably altered the course of history. The alliances and commitments of nations ensured that no part of the world would remain untouched by the unfolding struggle. From the capitals of Europe to the far reaches of the British Empire, from the streets of London and Paris to the ports of Sydney and Cape Town, the wheels of mobilization had begun to turn, setting in motion a conflict whose scale, intensity, and consequences would define the generation. The regional conflict that began on the quiet fields of Poland had, in a matter of days, ignited a war that was global in every sense, a war that would reshape borders, societies, and the very understanding of what it meant to live in a world at war. As the thunder of German armor swept across the Polish landscape, the human cost of Blitzkrieg became increasingly apparent, reaching far beyond the tactical victories that filled maps and reports. While tanks rolled through towns and mechanized infantry secured strategic positions, a darker, more harrowing aspect of the invasion unfolded behind the front lines, one that would leave scars on communities for generations to come. Civilians, who had hoped that the chaos of war would bypass them, soon found themselves facing the brutal realities of occupation, where fear and violence became daily companions. Villages were not merely captured, they were torn apart, their inhabitants subjected to the merciless implementation of control by units whose loyalty to ideology often outweighed any regard for humanity. In the small towns and rural settlements of Poland, the arrival of SS units and other German forces heralded terror that contrasted sharply with the ordered precision of military strategy. Families awoke to the distant sound of engines, unaware that within hours, their homes might be surrounded, their streets patrolled by soldiers who viewed resistance as an excuse for immediate reprisal. Reports of mass executions, shootings of prisoners, and targeted attacks on Jewish communities began to emerge, painting a grim picture of a war that had already begun to consume those who had no role in military decisions. In some villages, entire families were rounded up, women and children alike, and executed on suspicion or for the mere fact of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Churches, marketplaces, and schools, once centers of community life, became the backdrop for acts of violence that violated the very principles of humanity, leaving survivors to mourn not only the dead, but the destruction of a way of life. The psychological impact on the civilians who witnessed these atrocities was profound. Fear spread faster than the German advance itself, seeping into every corner of towns and villages. Parents struggled to shield their children from the horrors surrounding them, yet the sounds of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the smoke rising from burned homes made it impossible to maintain the illusion of safety. Jewish communities, in particular, bore the brunt of early persecution, facing arrests, beatings, and executions designed not only to punish but to terrorize, signaling the beginning of a systematic campaign of oppression that would escalate in the years to come. Each act of violence, no matter how localized, sent ripples of dread through neighboring communities, eroding trust and leaving civilians uncertain whom they could rely upon for protection. Even soldiers on both sides could not escape the moral complexity of these early weeks. While Polish troops focused on defense and retreat, witnessing the targeting of non-combatants added layers of fear, frustration, and sorrow. German officers, meanwhile, often faced the tension between following orders and confronting the human consequences of their actions. For many, adherence to ideology and military directives took precedence over compassion or restraint, leading to decisions that would later be judged as war crimes by history. Diaries, letters, and eyewitness accounts from this period reveal a landscape in which survival was uncertain. Moral lines were blurred, and the ordinary rhythms of life were violently disrupted by the machinery of occupation. The destruction extended beyond individual acts of violence to the broader social and economic fabric of Polish towns. Crops were destroyed or requisitioned, businesses were looted, and critical infrastructure was deliberately sabotaged to prevent resistance. The intent was both strategic and punitive. By disrupting everyday life, German forces aimed to prevent organized opposition, break the spirit of the populace, and ensure that any attempt to reclaim territory or mount counterattacks would face not only military obstacles but logistical impossibilities. The combination of fear, confusion, and deprivation created an environment where survival often depended on ingenuity, courage, and the willingness to navigate the complex and dangerous terrain of occupied life. Amid this suffering, stories of resilience and quiet defiance emerged. Some civilians risked their lives to hide neighbors or friends, while others found ways to communicate secretly, passing messages and warnings that could mean the difference between life and death. Underground networks began to form, laying the groundwork for organized resistance despite the overwhelming presence of German forces and the pervasive threat of punishment. These acts, often small and seemingly inconsequential at the moment, reflected an enduring human determination to assert agency even in the face of unrelenting oppression, hinting at the broader resistance movements that would later play a significant role in the war. The early weeks of the German invasion of Poland thus presented a dual reality: a war fought with tanks, aircraft, and strategy, and a shadow war against civilians, where ideology and terror were wielded as tools of domination. The experiences of towns and villages during this period illuminate the profound consequences of unchecked military aggression, illustrating how quickly the line between combatants and civilians can be obliterated in the pursuit of territorial and political objectives. By examining these events, it becomes clear that the story of September 1939 is not solely about battlefield tactics or national alliances. It is equally about human lives disrupted, communities fractured, and the moral dilemmas that arise when war reaches into the very heart of society. Even as Poland struggled to defend itself and allied nations began to respond, the immediate reality for civilians was one of vulnerability and loss. The deliberate targeting of non-combatants, the systematic persecution of Jewish populations, and the widespread destruction of villages signaled that the war would not only be measured in territorial gains or military victories, but also in the human suffering that accompanied the relentless drive for domination. The events of those early days stand as a stark reminder of the costs of war, emphasizing that behind every strategic maneuver and headline lies a network of human experiences marked by fear, resilience, and the enduring struggle to survive amidst chaos. The early days of September 1939 were not only defined by the relentless march of German forces across Poland, but also by the rapid expansion of conflict into the seas and skies, transforming what had begun as a land invasion into a multidimensional war that would stretch across continents and oceans. On September 3rd, the German U-boat U-30, commanded by Julius Lemp, struck a chilling note in this new chapter of warfare when it torpedoed the Athenia, a British passenger liner carrying over 1,000 civilians, including Americans, across the North Atlantic. The attack, unprovoked and tragically miscalculated, claimed the lives of 112 individuals, a stark reminder that in this conflict, the line between military targets and civilians could be terrifyingly thin. The sinking was not merely an isolated maritime incident. It was a harbinger of the perilous naval battles that would define much of the early years of the war, illustrating how the theaters of combat had expanded far beyond the immediate battlefield in Poland. For those aboard the Athenia, the sudden chaos was unimaginable. Families huddled together as the ship listed and lifeboats were lowered into the cold Atlantic waters. The cries of the wounded and the confusion of those attempting to survive blending into a tableau of desperation. Rescue efforts were hastily organized, but the psychological impact lingered long after the survivors reached safety, leaving a scar that would mark their memories for decades. The incident also sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels, prompting urgent discussions between governments and raising questions about neutrality, civilian safety, and the rules of engagement in a world that was quickly being consumed by global conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressing the American public, reassured citizens that the United States would remain neutral. But the sinking highlighted the precariousness of that stance and the growing sense that no nation would remain untouched by the war for long. Simultaneously, in the skies above Europe, the British Royal Air Force RAF began asserting its presence, not solely through combat but through psychological operations designed to undermine the enemy's morale. RAF bombers, equipped with tons of propaganda leaflets, crossed the North Sea and descended upon the industrial heartland of Germany, dropping millions of pieces of paper that warned German citizens of the consequences of supporting Hitler and his aggressive policies. These leaflets, printed with clear messages about the devastation and suffering that would follow a protracted war, were intended to sow doubt, fear, and reflection among civilians, signaling that modern warfare extended beyond tanks and artillery to encompass the battle for hearts and minds. In parallel, the RAF carried out targeted strikes against military positions, naval installations, and supply depots, demonstrating an early understanding that air power could disrupt not only the movement of troops, but also the logistical framework upon which a modern army relied. The interplay between naval and aerial operations in these initial days revealed a stark evolution in the conduct of war. No longer could conflicts be contained to land battles or singular theaters. The seas became hunting grounds, the skies arenas of psychological and physical assault, and every coastal town or port city a potential target. Strategists recognized that controlling supply routes, communications, and access points was as critical as winning ground engagements, and both German and Allied forces rapidly adapted their tactics to the new reality. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, seeking to sever Britain's lifelines of trade and supply, while the RAF's sorties demonstrated the capacity to project power across enemy territory without immediate ground engagement. These early operations foreshadowed the long, grueling Battle of the Atlantic and the strategic air campaigns that would come to define the war's prolonged and multifaceted nature. Civilians, yet again, found themselves entwined in the machinery of war, caught between the movements of armies, the stealth of submarines, and the roar of aircraft overhead. Port cities along the North Sea braced for bombardments, while families living inland followed news of naval engagements with apprehension, understanding that even distant waters could bring destruction to their doorsteps. The psychological dimension of these early campaigns cannot be overstated. Fear and uncertainty became pervasive, influencing public morale and shaping perceptions of the conflict long before any major ground engagement reached their vicinity. Stories of survival and narrow escapes from both the torpedoed Athenia and the leaflet-dropped towns circulated widely, emphasizing how modern warfare had expanded to engage not only soldiers but also entire populations in an invisible, yet profoundly real, theater of operations. These developments also highlighted the emerging complexity of command and coordination. Naval officers and air commanders were forced to navigate unprecedented challenges. Submarines had to identify targets accurately in an era before sophisticated tracking systems. Bomber crews required precise navigation to ensure effective delivery of both propaganda and ordnance. And communication lines had to remain intact across shifting theaters of war. Coordination between land, sea, and air forces became a critical determinant of success, requiring ingenuity, rapid decision-making, and the ability to anticipate enemy moves in an environment where information was often incomplete and stakes were existential. Each engagement, whether above the waves or over enemy factories, contributed to an intricate mosaic of strategy, revealing the increasingly interconnected nature of global warfare. By integrating naval and aerial operations into the broader conflict, the Allies and Axis powers alike began to recognize that World War II would demand more than conventional land campaigns. It would require mastery over the seas, control of the skies, and a nuanced understanding of human psychology as a weapon alongside bullets and bombs. The sinking of the Athenia and the RAF's propaganda missions underscored the immediacy and breadth of these lessons, illustrating how a war that began on the plains of Poland had instantaneously expanded into a global struggle where no citizen, soldier, or city could remain untouched. These early encounters set the tone for the months and years to come, a complex interplay of strategy, morality, and survival, where each decision carried weighty consequences, and where the lines between combatants and civilians were blurred by the sweeping scope of modern warfare. In retrospect, the events of those first days at sea and in the air were more than tactical maneuvers. They were signals of a new kind of war, one in which technology, psychology, and rapid, coordinated action would define the conduct and consequences of battle. The terror experienced by those on the Athenia and the quiet unease among German civilians receiving leaflets from the RAF were the first indications that World War II would be total, global, and profoundly transformative, reshaping not only borders but the very understanding of what it meant to wage and endure war. As the first week of September 1939 drew to a close, the grim reality of Adolf Hitler's ambitions became painfully clear, not just in the swift military campaigns and coordinated assaults across Poland, but in the ideological framework that underpinned them. Hitler's statements, openly declaring the destruction of the Jewish population in Europe alongside the expansion of German territory, left no ambiguity about the dual nature of his vision, a war waged not only with tanks, planes, and artillery, but with systemic persecution and terror as weapons aimed at entire communities. These declarations were not idle rhetoric, they were the blueprint for a campaign that would engulf Europe in unimaginable suffering and reshape the moral landscape of the continent forever. For the ordinary people of Poland, the weeks following the invasion became a harrowing lesson in vulnerability, resilience, and the stark consequences of unchecked totalitarianism. Families were torn apart, villages razed, and communities that had existed for centuries faced obliteration. The SS and other German forces carried out operations that blended conventional military objectives with ideological enforcement. Targeting Jews, political leaders, and anyone perceived as resistant or undesirable. In towns and cities, Jewish populations were rounded up, often separated from their families, humiliated, and in many cases executed. These actions marked the beginning of a systematic campaign of oppression, one that would intensify over the coming years into the horrific machinery of the Holocaust. At the same time, the conventional warfare continued unabated. German forces pressed their advantage, leveraging Blitzkrieg tactics to overwhelm the Polish military, disrupting lines of communication, and isolating pockets of resistance. Towns fell in rapid succession, leaving retreating soldiers and civilians alike struggling to navigate a landscape of chaos and destruction. Warsaw, Krakow, and Lodz became epicenters of both military strategy and human suffering, illustrating the intertwined nature of tactical warfare and the broader social consequences of occupation. As the Allies mobilized Britain, France, and the Dominions joining in rapid succession, the scale of the conflict became unmistakable. This was no longer a regional war. It had already transformed into a global struggle with moral, political, and human stakes of unparalleled magnitude. In the midst of this turmoil, stories of courage and humanity emerged, illuminating the resilience of individuals and communities even in the darkest of times. Ordinary civilians, risking their lives, hid neighbors or assisted those fleeing persecution, demonstrating the enduring power of empathy and solidarity. Members of underground networks began documenting atrocities and smuggling information to the outside world, ensuring that the horrors witnessed in occupied Poland would not go unnoticed. Meanwhile, soldiers on both sides grappled with the consequences of their actions, with some attempting to maintain a sense of honor and restraint even as the machinery of war and ideology pressed inexorably forward. These acts of defiance, compassion, and moral reflection remind us that even in periods of overwhelming darkness, human agency and cons persist. The broader implications of Hitler's declarations and the early weeks of the war were profound. For policymakers, military strategists, and citizens worldwide, it became evident that the conflict was not only about territory or national pride, but about the very principles of justice, human dignity, and civilization itself. The invasion of Poland, the targeting of civilians, and the overt declarations of genocidal intent revealed the unprecedented scope of the threat facing Europe and the moral imperative for collective action. Countries far from the front lines began to recognize that neutrality was fragile, that the expansionist ideology driving Hitler's decisions could not be contained without decisive resistance. The rapid response by Britain, France, and their allies underscored this recognition, signaling that in a world interconnected by treaties, trade, and shared human values, the repercussions of aggression would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. As we reflect on these events, it is crucial to understand that the early days of World War II were more than a prelude to larger military campaigns. They were the opening chapters of a moral reckoning. The systematic targeting of Jewish populations, combined with the conventional strategies of Blitzkrieg, demonstrated the terrifying potential of ideology fused with technology and organizational efficiency. The human cost was immense, and the suffering endured by millions reminds us of the consequences when hatred, ambition, and authoritarian power are allowed to operate unchecked. Yet within these stories of despair, the resilience, courage, and solidarity of ordinary people shine through, offering lessons that continue to resonate today. That vigilance, empathy, and decisive action are essential in confronting injustice, and that the choices of individuals and nations can either enable oppression or defend human dignity. As we close this chapter in history, it is important to carry forward these lessons, not only to understand the past but to inform the present and future. The early days of September 1939, with all their horror and complexity, remind us that the stakes of global conflict extend far beyond borders and armies. They touch every life, shape the moral fabric of society, and challenge humanity to respond with courage and compassion. The story of Poland's invasion and the onset of systemic persecution is a powerful testament to the importance of remembering, reflecting, and acting to prevent such tragedies from recurring. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this story meaningful and want to learn more about the pivotal moments that shaped the world, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations. Your support allows us to continue sharing these stories, honoring the past, and understanding the lessons that still echo through time. Stay curious, stay informed, and together, let us ensure that the voices of those who suffered are never forgotten.